How do I tell my fake boyfriend that I want him to be real? My therapist told me to write letters to an imaginary boyfriend. I know it sounds crazy, but after my last breakup left me feeling completely broken, she said it would help me figure out what I actually wanted in a relationship. So I made up this guy named Ryan. Perfect guy on paper. Thoughtful, funny, remembered my coffee order, never interrupted me when I talked about work drama. I was supposed to do this exercise for a month. 7 months later, I was still writing to Ryan every single night before bed. I'd tell him about my day, write about fights we'd have and how we'd work through them without screaming at each other. I even wrote about him meeting my parents at Christmas, how he'd bring my mom flowers and actually listen when my dad talked about golf for 3 hours straight. The problem started when I printed one of the letters at work by mistake. My coworker Ben found it in the printer tray Tuesday morning. He walked over to my desk holding this piece of paper, grinning like he'd discovered buried treasure. "So who's the mystery boyfriend?" he asked, waving the letter around. "Ryan sounds like a catch. When do we get to meet him?" I should have laughed it off, made up some story about a guy I was seeing. Instead, I panicked. I grabbed the letter so fast I knocked over my coffee all over my keyboard. Ben just stood there looking confused while I frantically tried to clean up the mess, mumbling something about how it was nobody important. That night, I sat in my apartment staring at the stack of letters I'd written. 43 letters to a guy who didn't exist. I realized I'd been comparing every real guy I met to Ryan, and obviously none of them could compete with someone I'd literally designed to be perfect. But then something weird started happening. I began noticing things about Ben that reminded me of stuff I'd written about Ryan, like how he always brought me soup when I called in sick, never questioned it or made it weird, how he actually listened when I talked instead of just waiting for his turn to speak. He even started putting that ridiculous sriracha sauce on everything after I mentioned in one letter how Ryan loved spicy food. It hit me one Friday when we were walking to the parking garage after work. Ben stopped at the little flower stand outside our building and bought daisies for his neighbor because her cat had just died. That's exactly something I'd written about Ryan doing. Standing there watching him count out quarters for this tiny old lady, I realized I might have been writing about Ben this whole time without even knowing it, so I told him everything. Right there in the parking garage between a Honda Civic and someone's motorcycle. I explained about the therapy exercise, about Ryan, about how I'd been writing love letters to an imaginary person for 7 months like some kind of crazy person. I told him how he'd somehow become everything I'd been pretending Ryan was. Ben listened to the whole thing without interrupting once. When I finished, he was quiet for so long I thought he was going to call security or something. Then he smiled and said, "Well, that explains why you always knew exactly what kind of coffee I liked." Turns out he'd been trying to ask me out for months but thought I had a boyfriend because I kept mentioning Ryan. We've been together for 3 weeks now, and I finally threw away all those letters. Ryan was great, but Ben's real.